So, thanks for coming for part 2.
Yeah.
So, I thought we...
Oh, yes, let's get this out of the way.
Yeah. What is this, Peter?
It's a book. I think it's called The Art of the Letter.
Yeah.
Is it called The Art of the Letter? I've forgotten.
I think so.
Okay. When preparing a kind of a theme for this conversation with Paul a few months ago, and this notion of, you know, the sort of the semiotics qualities that we can associate with typefaces, it reminded me of this extraordinary book that I found, I don't know, 25 years ago, called The Art of the Letter, where somebody has created a comparative compilation of type styles and letter forms with an associated period example of architecture or fine art, or in some cases sculpture, and in some cases object design. It's an extraordinarily beautiful book that produced by a Dutch type house.
The Amsterdam Type Foundry.
And it kind of runs up to about the 1950s. And when looking at it again, prior to the first part of this talk with Paul, I couldn't help thinking that it would be kind of interesting for somebody to bring it up to date. I also couldn't help thinking how diverse and complex that might become as you kind of cross the postmodern period through analog to digital, and the kind of atomized complexity of the now would, I think, be quite an interesting challenge to create visual analogies between contemporary fonts and resonant juxtapositions with other cultural artifacts. It would actually be a really quite remarkable and amazing book. But I don't think I want to do it. But we thought we would, Paul and I discussed it, and we thought we would mention it in case somebody in the room wanted to do it, or whether an entire committee of individuals might want to get together to produce such a book. I think it would benefit from the input of various perspectives. So if somebody wants to produce a very beautiful contemporary book that aligns typography with the broader cultural spectrum, a kind of a second edition of this book would be a nice thing.
Will you write the introduction?
Oh, fucking hell. I'm not... I could merely give guide. I mean, I'm so unacademic and so not hesitant, but procrastinate so much about writing things that it's difficult to even get me to write an email. Obviously, I would be very happy to discuss it from my point of view with somebody who then wanted to sit down for a week and write something.
Cool. So let's talk about your work then, Peter.
That's a bit easier. Okay.
So what are all these?
Well, that's okay. So this evening's talk is supposed to be covering the sort of late 90s, 2000s up to now period that we didn't get to cover a month ago. But it looks like briefly Paul is taking me back to 1980.
These are all monograms you did.
They're all monograms that were done. But as with seemingly all of my work, they were done by somebody else. I mean, it's really around about 1980, I met probably one of the most extraordinary individuals I had ever met up until that point, and arguably still one of the most extraordinary individuals I ever met. Tim Quay of the puppet maker, filmmakers, Gebruder Quay. Tim and his twin brother Stefan live in London still. They were originally American refugees from the draft, i.e. the Vietnam draft. And they ran away from America to avoid the draft as teenagers. And they ended up wandering Europe in search of a kind of 19th century ideal of European culture, but predominantly Eastern European culture, of theatre, literature, music, and to a certain extent art. And they were busy working on their own early films, of which Street of Crocodiles became their most known production. And they would do anything along the way to earn a bit of money. And I don't remember where I met him. I think I might have met him just on Portobello Road one day. He was riding his bicycle, dressed as a 19th century gentleman. Long tailcoat, flowing hair, and seemingly completely mad. But charming, and he must have seen something that I'd done, or somebody had done for me. And he came along and said, did I need any help? So, I mean, I always needed help. So Tim started coming into the studio that I had on Portobello Road as part of the record label Dindus, a Virgin building. But Tim would come in at like 6. As soon as someone was there to open the door, Tim Quay would turn up.
That's 6 in the morning or 6 in the evening?
No, I know, in the morning. I would turn up at 6 in the evening.
Okay.
Tim would come in the morning and do 3 or 4 hours work using my drawing board and predominantly the PMT camera, which he didn't have.
Yeah.
He excelled in the existence of that. And Tim would come in and I'd turn up at lunchtime or something. And almost the entire room would be like covered in bits of paste up. He was like a kind of genius Rumpelstiltskin kind of character.
So he did all of these?
He did all of these. I mean, we talked about, I mean, he and his brother Stefan had lots of these pseudo-European marks and stamps.
So what did you actually use them for then?
For the talk this evening.
He could see in the future as well. That's amazing.
I mean, at least one of them, the Dessin Contrôlé, that did go on a work.
Yeah.
Tim dreamt up this name, League of Artists. But we didn't really use them for anything because it would have been inappropriate to put such a kind of evident and idiosyncratic mark of one's own on somebody else's work.
Yeah.
So I think I had a few of them made into rubber stamps. In fact, I definitely had a few made into rubber stamps. And used to sometimes just do that thing where you could put like the stamp into different colors and make pretty colored rubber stamps. I did that with them a lot.
But then you actually started a business.
So a little bit later,
so is this 1983?
83. 83. What's the address? 249, 251, Kensal Road. That was, in a way, what we could say the first Peter Saville studio, Peter Saville Associates.
But what's this based on? This is kind of design. It's a bit like a piece of typesetting equipment.
It is. It's based on a font card.
Yeah.
Of a Linotronic or some other origin. The thing that baffles me now is how did I know about that in 83? But actually, hang on, Power Corruption Lies is 83.
Power Corruption Lies is
Okay,
a
so
Berthold.
this will be around about the same time as Power Corruption Lies, and at that point I was beginning to pay attention to the kind of the computer-based ephemera of typesetting. So I obviously saw this template as a font card. They were usually glass discs, not discs, glass cards, with the font on it, and I obviously based it on that.
Very classical typeface, isn't it?
Well,
Palatino?
It's fucking Palatino. Don't ask. I mean, I only knowingly used Palatino for Roxy Music Flesh and Blood. But the reason I used it was the only font available that night at the only typesetters I knew.
That's a good reason.
I had 18 hours to do Flesh and Blood, and I was very limited. I was limited in my contacts, resources, and knowledge. And as it turned out, the only serif font that was available to me that night was Palatino. So I did Flesh and Blood in Palatino. But obviously I liked it enough to use it for PSA. Okay, all right, so that's off a letterhead, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Much later, well, not that much later, actually, 5 years later.
88?
87, 88, when we relocated to near here to Charterhouse Square, the Helvetica Noi light, ultralight fixation had overcome the studio. We'd become brave enough to use Helvetica for Touched by the Hand of God that we showed last time. And there was for a period, Brett, Richard Smith, the various people working with me just couldn't use anything other than the Helvetica. Yeah, that's Helvetica Light for letterhead. They were obsessed with it.
But this is much later. This is kind of like 2000s now, no longer.
I think that is on the card that I have at the moment, and the rarely used letterhead and comp slip.
Peter Saville as a brand.
Yeah, but like amateur brand. What was more in my mind was the way the printer might have put an artist name on the front of a kind of a modest catalogue in the 60s or early 70s.
Kind of Gordon House.
Possibly. I don't know. I think I've got a Hamilton catalogue, which is Richard Hamilton in caps, sans serif caps on the front.
Probably designed by Gordon House.
Gordon House, okay. So, kind of in a way, entirely non-committal.
Yeah.
And in caps for a certain thingness. It's difficult when you see your own name in upper and lower case. Somehow doesn't look like a thing.
Yeah.
And this is an attempt, I suppose, at Peter Saville as a thing.
But this is my favourite. This is the way I think of you. This beautiful.
There's been a lot of those over the years. You've redrawn many of them. Is this one that you redrew?
No, this is actually your handwriting.
Is it? Okay.
Or signature, when I need to fake it.
It's a signature that came from people asking me to sign things, because it's not what you might call my legal signature. If I was to sign a document, or in the old days a check, it would not look like this. But when people first asked me to sign things and I used my formal signature, they sort of like, you know, handed it back saying, can't read it, don't know what it says. So therefore I had to develop a kind of a handwritten way of doing Peter Saville, in order for people to be happy when I sign their things. And it changes a lot. It's very difficult signing your own name a lot. like if you have to do a print edition and sign like 100 or 200, I had to do 600 once. And I found that you can only do about 20.
Yeah.
And then you have to stop, wander around, have a glass of water, a cup of coffee, tea, something, go back, do another 20. After like 20, 25, it begins to become really erratic. And you end up, and then and after a certain point, you don't even recognize what your name is. So it's quite, they're not easy, these. Anyway, I'm sure this is the end of it, but just sort of anecdotally, in the latter part of the 80s, I was looking at ways, after that Helvetica one, I was looking at ways to write Peter Saville so often that my studio colleagues sort of goaded me one day with a bit of a parody. I went into the studio one day, and there was a book on my table. Not like a bound book, but a kind of, with one of those sliding plastic things that holds like 48 pages together. And it was a book of all of the ways that I'd asked them to write Peter Saville.
What happened to that book?
It's in the archive, I think. I think Tom's seen it. It was embarrassing, actually. I mean, every other week I was saying, like, look at this. Oh, let's try Peter Saville in that font. And of course, after 6 months, 12 months of this, my colleagues found it tedious and embarrassing. So they made this book to either say, make your mind up, or stop wasting our time.
If you had to do it today, what font would you use now? Or do you just not care anymore?
I don't know. It's the worst. The worst. It's the hardest thing you can be asked to do as a graphic designer, is your own material. I mean, the default is to really to undo it, to be very, very modest and nondescript about it. But then you look at it and you think, well, that's a bit boring. No, it's really difficult.
I know.
Yeah. I mean, one of my favorites, we talked about books, and I mentioned the Piet Zwart book that I still had from Manchester Library. One of my favorites is actually Piet Zwart's letterhead, which is a letter P in black.
Yeah.
Because his name's Peter Black. So, that's kind of nice. I think if you can solve the problem that way, it's great.
So what's next? Let's see.
Okay, good.
So we're back to the 80s.
Yeah.
So this was done when you were at Pentagram or before Pentagram?
No, this is definitely when we were at Pentagram. Is Republic and Regret there by any chance?
Yeah, they're coming next.
Okay. Okay, but all right. Well, they're slightly back to front, but Exposure was a commission from a photographic gallery in Tokyo. I don't think I knew who they were at the time. Sometimes commissions from Japan can be quite obscure. And it was obscure. I don't know who they were, and I don't know how it got to me, but they said that they were going to have a photographic gallery called Exposure, which I thought was quite interesting, good name,
yeah.
Photo gallery. And would we make a logo? And we did. And
was this done in Photoshop or manually?
Well, why it's there this evening is because this was one of our Brett. It was certainly Brett, who is not here this evening. Brett's first experiments with putting type through Photoshop, I mean, most likely Gaussian blur or similar.
Motion blur.
Or motion blur. Yeah, it's fully motion blur. And so in a way, kind of evoking the darkroom development or focusing or blur that we might associate with a previous era, like a kind of slightly out of focus darkroom look that you might have done in the 60s for someone called Exposure. We sort of like looked at it with motion blur. So in a way, kind of the digital transition. And of course, it was creating these slightly melded shapes with the letters. So this is a little bit before Neville presented his blur font. Ah, I think you're looking for flow motion.
There it is.
Yeah, okay. So
when did you first get a computer in the studio then?
88. Malcolm, oh, well, there's Malcolm. You had the first generation, didn't you? 86?
Yeah, F42Es.
Which was?
In 83.
Fucking hell.
Before sorry.
Okay. What did we get? Second generation Mac?
My first one was a Mac Plus.
Right.
Which was...
I would say it was... Okay, I would say it was 87.
Which, yeah, we got in 86. They came out in 84, we got it in 86.
Right, okay. Brett's opinion was that the next generation one would be better or something?
Yeah, the Mac 2 was...
Yeah, the Mac 2. Okay, so we got Mac 2. So it was all pretty obscure to me, Paul, and I decided there and then, when we had 3 Macs, I think, delivered, I was not going to get involved. And I'm still not.
Can you write an email?
There was a reason that I didn't. I can write an email, even though I don't want to because it reminds me of school essays. But yeah, I will write an email. There was a reason, which I don't really want to go into now, but it was to do with artwork.
Yeah.
And it was to do with 24/7, 7 days a week, being expected to deliver artwork, and the irregularities of the music business and the fashion business, which meant that at any time of any day of the week, I could be expected to deliver a piece of artwork. And we were being expected to deliver a piece of artwork every weekend, every night. And it was relentless. And because I could do mechanical artwork and order type, I felt obliged as the principal of the studio that if no one else was there, it was my duty. And it was my duty to be there anyway, even if someone was helping me. It still had to go through me. And I was tired of it. And there were really aggressive threats from people in that period.
The 80s.
Well, I would imagine the same now. When you are the last link in somebody's long-planned or high-budget project, great pressure is brought to bear on you. And sometimes it's quite aggressive. I told you, I think I mentioned this last time. Alan Erasmus sent guys from Manchester to sort me out about a late factory sleep.
Do you remember which one it was?
Yes, it was for a group called Stockholm Monsters or something. And it was actually only the intervention of Rob Gretton, who was concerned as to what the outcome might be, that it didn't happen, that said people did not turn up to sort me out. Even my favourite client of all time, Mark Fennick, the manager of Roxy Music, threatened that, he said, if that's not there by 5 o'clock, you're going to get your legs broke. And he was my favourite client. So, and a very nice civil gentleman.
Yes.
So, anyway, what happened was that once the Macintoshes came into the studio and the work disappeared into their digital process, when my colleagues had left the premises, I actually couldn't do anything.
So you turned the computers off and just...
Well, they were off. I mean, so for the first time ever, when called on a Sunday afternoon at 5 o'clock to say, can we have this tonight?
You said no.
I said, well, yeah, of course. I'm here for you as ever. But it's in the computer. And there's no one here. And then there would be swearing and fuck, and it's a fucking disaster. And then for the first time ever, someone said, so when will they be there? And I said, well, tomorrow in the morning. And then finally I got okay, tomorrow morning. And never before had anyone ever relented and said, okay, tomorrow morning. So as far as I'm concerned, the work stayed in the computer, and I honestly stayed at arm's length from it.
So anyway, this is the only typeface.
Right, so this is where it all went horribly wrong. So we did exposure. It was quite clear from exposure that you could create some very interesting new transitional letter forms by using forms of blur. And Neville did. He created that font blur.
Blur.
It's like, fuck. And then Neville found that his Fuse project, and he asked me to do a font. So I was kind of thinking, well, he's taken the blurred sans. Maybe I can do something with a blurred
serif.
So I turned to Brett.
What did Brett say?
Fuck off.
You were at Pentagram.
We were at Pentagram. We had a fee target to chase which we were woefully below. We were busy, and Brett said, doing a font is not easy. And I said, come on, it can't be that difficult. He said, it is, and I'm not doing it. And I said, but it's for Neville. And he said, I don't care. Say no.
But you still...
Well, in the end, I couldn't say no. So like, there was a phone call, and I came off the phone, and Brett looked at me, and he said, you're doing it, aren't you? And I said, yes. He said, well, you're on your own. So, and he was resolute about it. Brett refused to help. So I found myself having to create a font with a pencil. So because I didn't have any other way of working. So we blurred a font. I got, someone blurred a font for me.
And you drew over it.
And I drew around it. And unfortunately, a very nice assistant designer at Pentagram called Meta Height, Meta said she would help. And we created flow motion by hand. And it's like a bunch of old bones. It's awful. There's one or two nice letters, like the M is actually quite nice.
Yeah, it's nice.
But the lowercase letters are hideous.
It's very 1990s, isn't it?
What it was. And
what was it used for, ever?
Porn covers. I've seen it on a lot of porn covers, which is kind of amuses me, but it's also, whenever I see it, it's embarrassing because it's not good.
You didn't make much money from it then?
Well, of course not. Ask Neville. I have no idea. That's an obscure pathway. I mean, there was never any notion of any money. Was there, Malcolm? No, never a notion.
Anyway.
I'm sure Neville just gave them away.
So this was also done...
Okay, so... But apparently Neville made some money.
All right. This is back to New Order. So this is New Order at Pentagram.
I put this in because it was the same period of early Photoshop experimentation. So I didn't... Okay. Brett was curious about the blur filter that was in Photoshop, and I think it was there for retouching, and we used it to create a vignette between images. So I just wanted to include it because, of course, it was exactly the same time that we were playing around with motion blur, with the exposure thing, and also to mention that this was the first time, with Regret and Republic and the other associated releases, that I chose a typeface for ironic purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was a bit shocked when I saw this.
Yeah, good.
It's very un-Peter Saville.
Totally. This is 92, 93, by that time, having gone through the 80s and experienced the kind of cataclysmic effect of a recession on my life, my being, on everything. The recession of 92, 93 affected my outlook on life.
This was when Factory Records went bankrupt?
Factory went bankrupt. I ended up at Pentagram. Everything fell apart. So after endeavoring for a decade to do good work and to make things better, it all ended in a fucking mess anyway. And through the 80s, you know, I was pursuing some kind of idealized utopian notion about things being better. When I realized in the early 90s how duplicitous, how corrupt, and how fucked up everything really is, and banks and institutions and government, you know, it took until my mid-30s to lose respect, any respect, for the institutions of state. You know, as a kind of bourgeois, aspirational middle-class boy who'd had a relatively comfortable upbringing, I didn't question the system. You know, I didn't come from a background or family that questioned everything. I was not in any way political. But my own personal experiences in 90, 91, 92, 93, eventually having my car taken away, my property taken away, my bank accounts, having everything taken away. And then seeing how I'd just been caught up in the circumstances of a kind of gaming economy, and what I felt complete dereliction of duty of government to actually look after the priorities of people's lives, such as their homes. This gave me an entirely different perspective on my relationship to the world. And I went from a kind of utopian point of view to a dystopian point of view.
And then you moved to Los Angeles.
Well, prior to moving there...
You did this. But this seems like almost a calling card.
Prior to moving, we had, whilst I was at Pentagram, Brett and I had 5 weeks in LA doing a project, doing a TV identity.
I think that might be.
And during, no, it's not that one, that was later. And whilst I had lived in Los Angeles for 5 weeks, it's quite, well, you always see the world differently in another place. So where we live, we tend to take for granted, we tend not to notice, you know, like you don't see the wood for the trees sometimes in your own environment. But when you go to another place, you are, for a while, much more observant.
Yeah.
And Los Angeles is an extraordinary sort of hybridized place, which is a little bit like, in itself, a journey through TV channels, right? You know, every street corner in Los Angeles evokes a movie you've seen or a TV series you've seen. You realize that it's disappointing at first because you think, fuck, the movie makers just go outside and film. You know, they just use LA as just the backdrop for so much of the culture that we receive. And it is an extraordinarily contradictory and fucked up place.
Did you like it? Because you moved there.
We moved to try something out. In the end, my conclusion about LA is I really like it if I have a ticket out. Not necessarily tomorrow or next week, but if I have an open ticket out and I can leave when I'm ready to leave, I like it.
So you spent how long there?
A year. Anyway, we were there for 5 weeks. And after that 5 weeks, I came back with a concept in my head called Pacific Coast Highway. And if you just go back to Republic, that's what this was about. And it's the result of having 52 TV channels in your hotel room.
Which is hardly anything now.
Yeah, but at the time, there were 52 channels, 53 channels on the hotel room set, with no logical sequence to them at all. So like on a Sunday, there would be sport, drama, violence, game shows, shopping, evangelism, some sort of erotic thriller, bit more evangelism. And you would go through the channels and it was a really kind of dystopian snapshot of the world. And the whole Republic thing is based on that. So therefore, the typefaces are based on the sorts of relatively simplistic, cheap fonts that you get for TV movies.
Sort of kind of like this one.
And yeah, exactly.
Movie title.
Exactly. You know, it's a bit like it's a riff, it's a cheap riff off The Unforgiven. And the New Order production at the top is in Handel Gothic, which is the, according to Brett, was the Warner Home Movie Channel typeface. So the whole thing is a parody, and ironic, and erring towards the dystopian. And it is fair to say that that was a step I had never made in my work.
So then this was done later?
That's a bit later. A good friend and client called David Newman, who we did the TV channel for, he popped up a few years later, involved in something called the Digital Entertainment Network, and I went back to Los Angeles for a month and did Den.
Was this with
just the arrow being, you know...
Input?
Yeah.
Were you there when the O.J. Simpson thing happened? Just out of curiosity.
We
don't need to dwell on
No,
it.
we were, because the riots that followed the trial were happening
that was
down Wilshire Boulevard when we were there.
That was the other...
Was that? OJ, yeah, when actually...
No, that was before OJ.
Yeah, OJ, yes, we were there then. 94.
So this
Then we came back.
Then we came back.
Well, I came back.
Brett stayed. And this is kind of mid-90s.
And I came back.
What's this band, Peter?
Gay Dad.
Who were Gay Dad?
So Gay Dad, I don't know, they were a band on London Records. And London Records had a wonderful man called...
Alan?
Thank you. Alan Parks. Thank you, Alan Parks. Who handled New Order at London, and he would occasionally ask me to do things if there was something interesting. And he mentioned a group called Gay Dad. And we needed work. Change it? Is it working? Yeah? Yeah. And the interesting thing was, it was the provocation of the name Gay Dad.
Because they wrote a massive brief, didn't they? Like a 14-page brief about what they should be.
Yes, something like that. Anyway, the conversation was Gay Dad. In the end, I think I concluded that Gay Dad was potentially every man. That anybody, like gay and dad, I mean, basically, there was something universal about this composite, gay and dad. And so we had a conversation about what is the universal man in Great Britain. And we concluded that Margaret Calvert's pedestrian man was, in fact, every man.
And people were really baffled by this.
Well, I quite like it when we did with his kids going the other way on the previous... Yeah, you see, so I quite like this. That was a rather cheeky juxtaposition. No.
She always complains about that particular symbol because it's meant to be her.
Oh, what, the children one or the...
Yeah, the children one.
All right, okay. No, I mean, I didn't know Margaret Calvert. I knew of her. And people like Paul Barnes would tell me about her. Interestingly, when I came back from Los Angeles, one of the places I went was the Royal College of Art to ask them to offer some visiting input, which I won't say they declined, but they never called me back.
I can't believe...
So, fuck it.
Do you want to come up and take over?
So, no, I'm very happy for Malcolm to engage. So I didn't know Margaret, but I was certain that there would be some kind of, questioning feedback. But to my knowledge, there wasn't.
You sent me down to HMSO to get the book, How to Make Road Signs.
Good.
So we did it properly.
But it was an appropriation.
It was wrong.
But these signs saying Gay Dad this way, I mean, they were really effective.
Yeah. And then the band were a little underwhelming.
Yeah. That tends to happen. Anyway, so that was Gay Dad. Go on, what next? Okay.
So this is
All right.
this is all about fashion, Peter.
Yeah.
Something that's always been in your life, but
Yeah.
in the 2000s came calling. Givenchy. How did this happen?
Well, it'd come obviously through initially in the 80s with Nick Knight and Mark, and we did the catalogs for Yoji. So my first induction into slightly more rarefied atmosphere of progressive design fashion was in 86, 87, where it is fair to say we created the template for the fashion catalogs and media that were to follow. When I first did a Yoji catalog, I mean, no one really did them. I mean, Nick Knight, it was at Nick Knight's insistence. He suggested to Mark Askley, who was the Yoji's art director from Paris, that a graphic designer be involved in doing a catalog. And Mark actually said, what is a graphic designer? And Nick said, someone to put together this catalog with me. And Mark was kind of like, oh, my dear, you know, like, take the fucking pictures. We take the pictures to Tokyo. The printer come. They make a catalog. Duh. Why do you want another person? Anyway, Nick being Nick insisted. Mark and I met. We got on well. And I did my first fashion catalog and the first transformative catalog for Yoji in 1986. And so that was my first run-in with it. Then in the 90s, I worked on Dior with Nick and Refat, and there were quite a few projects, particularly the Dior one was an important one in the 90s. And then in around about early 2000s, in the beginning, no, thanks. In the reactivation of the major historic houses, mainly the ones being acquired by LVMH, this regeneration of the logos, the identities, regeneration of the houses started. Givenchy was one where there was experimentation going on. John Galliano, you know, first went to Givenchy, then went on to Dior. Alexander McQueen came in and did Givenchy for a while.
Julian McDonald?
Julian McDonald got invited, and I got invited to just review the Givenchy logo, which I asked you to help me with.
And we do.
It was really intimidating because, you know, I had quite a degree of regard for Hubert de Givenchy and his principles in the work that he did. And when you're doing something like this, you know, you can feel the presence of the founder over your shoulder. And I thought that we must not lose the essence of the letter form or lettering that he himself had chosen, but undeniably it needed a little bit more body and whack putting it into it for the kind of higher profile marketing of, you know, of the 2000s. So that was the first one we did.
Is there another one we did?
I don't like being reminded of this one because it's
I showed it to you this afternoon. You didn't say it then.
No, but I just saying it now. I don't mind seeing it. And the weird thing about it is it works really well for Kate. It almost looks like Kate Moss, if one could say such a thing. And, you know, as ever, we showed her 20 options. This was one that you'd proposed. It is by Alexei Brodovich, is that correct? And it was interesting, in going through the book of proposals, the minute she saw this, Kate said, that's the one I want. And I said, okay, let's finish the book. And she said, we will. And then she went back to it and said, that's the one I want. Kate chose that immediately the moment she saw it. And, you know, I mean, that basically is the job of graphic designer. So fine, done. I mean, it's very timely. I mean, it felt quite good when do you any idea when we did it?
2005,
4, 3, 5.
something like that.
Yeah. I mean,
It was all about the K and the S.
yeah, I mean, it's a very fashiony looking bit of type, and it looked okay for the brief existence. I mean, it probably outlived the label.
Yeah.
So, there you go. It's outlived its own product. So fine. Oh, okay. The garage.
The garage.
The garage.
Are we allowed to talk about this?
Yeah, we might get poisoned. Well, yeah, I mean, Dasha Zakova. It's the garage. The thing that I found interesting about it was that everyone knew that there was this new gallery in Moscow. And
it's an old bus terminal.
It is, and that was the basis of the angular shape, because the bus terminal is built on a diagonal to facilitate the limited turning curve of the buses, so the drivers could kind of go straight in without having to back up. And I liked it because it says garage in Russian, and even though what I liked is you don't need to be able to read Russian to guess that it's probably the garage, which is kind of how it worked. Because if you know there's a contemporary gallery in in Moscow, or Russia actually, because it didn't even say Moscow. If you know there's a contemporary gallery in Russia and there's an add-in frieze, that's probably the garage.
So this is something contemporary, well,
it's
people have been talking
about.
Like
3 weeks ago, contentious.
England, not typographical at all.
2011.
This was just after South African World Cup?
For South Africa, they had all white shirt.
Do you remember the brief?
Yeah. I remember distinctly because it was the contradiction. We would like to have a very colourful white shirt.
Yeah.
So the all-white kit for the World Cup in South Africa had been exceedingly popular with everybody. So they wanted to have a white shirt, but they wanted it to be very colourful. So we better move on a bit. Let's go to the next picture. Okay, so the only relevant motif to work with was the Cross of St. George. And I thought it would be timely to retrieve that symbol from the rather aggressive form of patriotism that had grasped it, basically men in white vans, and bring it back to all of the people and use it as the conduit for the colour that they wanted in the shirt. And for it to become a multicoloured shirt to represent the diversity of modern England. This was the idea. I mean, in the end, it narrowed down to like 4 colours, which were the principal colours in the shield or the badge or something. I mean, I kind of wanted it to be, you know, millions of colours, but in the end, Umbro narrowed it down to blue, red, purple, green, something like that. And we created these endless iterations of repeat patterns in different sizes and shapes that appeared all over a white shirt.
But this is the one that wasn't used. They only used it on the shoulders, didn't they?
Well, yeah, Fabio Capello didn't like it. I think he thought it was a bit gay. So the most difficult, for me, from my point of view anyway, aspect of this project was not having any personal interaction with the decision makers, i.e. the board of the FA.
Yeah.
None whatsoever. So giving the material to Umbro, who would then create their own samples and then take them to the FA. In fact, I had one of the most extraordinary ever client sample experiences in that whilst this was going on, I was doing my Manchester residency, and one evening I got on the train either to go to Manchester in the evening for a meeting the next day or vice versa, whatever. But I was on the train, and the lady who worked for Umbro, who was interacting with the FA.
The FA liaison officer.
FA liaison officer, or Umbro's FA liaison. Yeah. So she was on the train as well. And we literally bumped into each other in the carriage. And she had a bag and she said, "I've just been at the FA." And I went, how did it go? She said, "Oh, they liked it." I said, well, she said, "Do you want to see it?"
Your work?
Yeah. "Do you want to see your work?" On a shirt that the FA have just approved. And I went, "Be nice, yeah?" And she said, "Come with me." So we had to go into the interconnecting bit between the carriages. It was like a sort of bad movie. And she lifted this shirt out from her bag and then put it straight back in again. I said, "Looks great." That was it. And that was all I saw. It was really, I mean, they were paranoid about anybody seeing it. So I had a glimpse of it in a train corridor. And I didn't really see it until I went to Wembley one night and they played Bulgaria. And it was, you know, to all intents and purposes, invisible.
There was no comments whatsoever.
There was very little feedback.
The only thing was the price of it.
Yeah. So compared to the furore a month ago, which even involved the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition, and Nike with one little coloured cross on the back of the neck, in 2011,
nothing.
This was pretty much completely under the radar. And it's one failing, which I needed a journalist to point out to me. And it's one failing, it could be said for Umbro, was that the core market for England kit are the very people who were affronted by it. Mm. So if you actually think who buys England merch for themselves, their mates and their kids, they don't want any of these other colours going on.
So that's England.
Okay.
What's next?
I was just going to say, I was just going to say apologies if I'm not as buoyant as I was last month. It's partly because I don't feel well, but whilst just chatting to a friend outside, I realised that I was happier doing the work that I did or was involved in. I was happier doing that work in the 80s in a certain kind of blissful ignorance than I have been since. And yeah, I've been reasonably disappointed with the world for the last 30 years. So I can't speak about it with as much
enthusiasm.
Yeah, it's a mood, really. It's a mood. It's there's been a lot of things that I found disappointing for the last decade or so, or a few decades actually. It's actually a bit better now, but I'm still waiting for it to be good.
But you're quite enthused by Brian Cox.
Brian, well, there are things that I've done and people that I've worked with that I've been really happy about. Brian Cox being one of them. We met because of a T-shirt. Whenever he first started doing little kind of part appearances on like episodes of Horizon or something, probably, I don't know, 90s, early 2000s maybe. I was slightly curious about this, obviously, northern bloke, who looked a bit kind of pop star-ish, particularly for that astrophysics community, and who sort of spoke well about kind of
Science.
and the phenomenal. So I liked him, and then a friend, Alice Rawsthorne, actually said I should check out his Den talk that he'd given. She sent me a link to a talk that he'd done at Den.
Yeah.
And when you do Den, you get 13 minutes. That's your slot. Everyone gets 13 minutes. And it was really interesting because in very typical Brian Cox way, he went out on the stage and said, okay, I've got 13 minutes. I'm going to explain to you everything we know about the universe in the next 13 minutes. And of course, and he did, you know, very succinctly.
So it's in this book.
Brilliantly sort of summed up the then knowledge, understanding of the universe. Anyway, whilst he was doing that, he was wearing a very rare Joy Division related t-shirt.
Which one?
It's a t-shirt that says every 1.337 seconds. And it was a t-shirt that I did at the request of Paul Smith for a limited edition of shirts associated with Anton Corbijn's Control movie. So Anton Corbijn made his movie Control, and somebody asked Paul Smith, a PR person, asked Paul Smith Company to do some gifting t-shirts associated with the release of the film. Somehow Brian Cox got one, and Brian Cox obviously liked it and wore it when he gave this talk to explain the universe. And of course, of all of the people in the world to understand every 1.337 seconds, it's Brian. It's the frequency that the pulsar CP1919 rotates, informing that wave pattern that people know from unknown plagiarists. It's CP1919 spins every 1.337 seconds. So we kind of just became pals. And Brian is, in everyday reality, very much as you see him on TV. He's very likable, he's incredibly sweet, and remarkably tolerant of stupid questions about the universe. Which, without a doubt, he's heard them all before, and always very politely says, now that's a very interesting question. And so we just became pals, really. I invited him to contribute to an event in Manchester that I proposed when Tony Wilson died, and so we met, and we have continued to be, you know, friendly with one another. So he asked Penguin were doing this book about the quantum universe, and he asked for me to do the cover. And even though I try not to get involved in things like book covers for all the obvious reasons,
you couldn't say no.
No, you couldn't say no. And also, I mean, I was happy to do it once we started.
So it's a very un-Peter Saville typeface you chose.
Well,
who chose? Did you choose it?
So, whenever this was, by the sort of
2015, something like that.
Yeah. So the person who has become my most significant creative colleague and contributor for the last 10 years or more is Paul Hetherington, who's sitting here at the front. So in the same way that Brett defined the work in the 80s and various people contributed in the 90s, Paul very much has defined the last decade or so. And Paul and I have known each other since the early days of Peter Saville Associates, which was like that first job for him. Then he had his own life and career. And then this last 10 or 15 years, he has supported me in almost everything that I've had to do. And, you know, we were obviously talking about the weirdness of quantum, and Paul knew of a typeface called Lino, with a Y, L-Y-N-O, that a young type designer called, I think his name is Radim Pesko, probably Czech, living and working in London. He had been developing this very idiosyncratic font called Lino, which had multiple character variations, some of which were really quite exotic and unpredictable. Now, I think when I was thinking about this yesterday, and I realized that when Paul probably first explained it or mentioned it to me, I think I thought that it was a little bit weirder than it even was. I think I sort of thought that when you press the character, you didn't know what you would get, but I think it's not quite as random as that. But we used it. I mean, the Quantum Universe book, it has the subtitle, Everything That Can Happen Does Happen, which is very interesting to think about how we've ended up even being here this evening. And I liked this idiosyncratic font for its kind of disruptive, idiosyncratic evocation of nowness. It's kind of like everything at the same time. And in that sense, very symbolic of the kind of dystopian, atomized nature of things now.
So what's this piece?
So Meaningless Excitement was, I don't know, probably the same year as Brian's book or a little time afterwards, when the relationship with Yoji came back round again through Adidas. Yoji has a label brand called Y3, which is produced and distributed by Adidas. Obviously, I have history with Yoji going back to the 80s, and I had some history with Adidas. And in a fairly archetypal Yoji way, by, let's say, 2014, 15, when this arose, I think it's fair to say that he couldn't be bothered anymore. My most touching experience with Yoji was in 1990 when he couldn't be bothered.
By this point, he's...
There was a moment when he couldn't be bothered, and that aligned totally with that first dystopian feeling of mine. And I did a campaign for Yoji called Game Over, which he liked a lot. And it kind of, it created a bit of a kind of pessimistic bond between Yoji and I. A kind of pessimistic realism about the world. He realized that I thought it was all as fucked up and unnecessary as he did. So when this came round in 2000, I think it's 2014, Yoji's design office in Tokyo did not have any clothes. They didn't have any designs for the next Y3 collection. Mm. And it seems like nobody really had any ideas for it either. So somebody at Adidas had the idea, why don't we create the fabric and then perhaps the design studio can respond to the fabric?
Yeah. And
for some reason, they asked me if I would create the fabrics for a Y3 collection. Whether it was Yoji's idea or whether it was Adidas' idea, I don't know, but they did. And I didn't really want to do it either. Because, I mean, Yoji couldn't be bothered, and I couldn't be bothered. I mean, who needs it?
So you came up with this?
Well, no, I didn't. I said I don't know. And the previous time I'd done something with Adidas, it was for a shoe, and that backfired on them beautifully. But let's not go into that. I didn't know whether I wanted to do it, because it was pointless. Okay, Yoji couldn't be bothered, and I couldn't be bothered, because who needs another fucking Y3 collection?
But you did it.
Well, I did it in the end because I was sitting on the train to Manchester one morning, and there was a review of Django Unchained.
Yeah.
Right? And whilst reading the review, there was this phrase where the reviewer referred to it as Tarantino's usual brand of meaningless excitement.
And you thought,
Well, I just was like, meaningless excitement. I thought, that is a perfect phrase to summarize the state of our commercialized culture now. All of it. Meaningless excitement. Films, fashion, product, design, graphics, all of it. Obviously, it's partly because of my age and fatigue from it all. And I'm sure that if you're 25, it's terribly exciting. But if you're like 60, it's not. And I just thought, meaningless excitement sums it up. So I thought, quite like to say that. So I went back to Adidas and said, I could do it if I can call the collection Meaningless Excitement.
and what did they say?
They went, oh no, not again. I'd done a similar thing with them with a shoe a few years earlier, and they were like, oh, fuck. And I said, I think you should ask Yoji.
And what did Yoji say?
Yes. So Yoji loved it. So Paul Henderson and I then just gathered together. There was a comment about dystopian Americana. So we just gathered together as many elements of dystopian Americana that we could, that we liked. There were a lot of phrases that we found. Paul supplied a lot of those ridiculous phrases from websites and online sources where you know, those searches that end in futility, online shopping ventures that then don't work. All of the negative experiences to do with online existence. We gathered together all of these phrases and made fabrics out of them. I fucking love that. I mean, that's a sort of Rorschach condensation on a custom car flipped with meaningless excitement put in the middle of it. And then maybe is there anything else from it or not?
No, but
okay.
It goes into a different phase in your career.
No, that's one of them.
Oh, it is?
Yeah. Yeah. That was one of the phrases. I don't know whether we used it or not. I just wanted to include it to show. We used the Lino font, made, you know, three-dimensional objects out of it, and just fucked around with it. And it's all just stuff. I mean, it's quite like it, but it's stuff. And there might be a couple of examples of more. Yeah, here you go. So
what is this? It's not very typographic.
I can't really say what that is because it's an unrealized project. But it's sort of where, I mean, I'd like to say that where we went, Paul went there. And I thoroughly supported him going there. And it was quite important to include it. Is there a big blacked out one next? Yeah, that. I mean, that's typography. That's typography for me, 2015. That's how I feel about it.
What does it say?
I can't say what it says because that would give away the purpose of the job and it would not be correct because it was not published. But it does say a name there. So, I mean,
Taylor Swift?
Well, she didn't like it. Okay.
Oh.
So, I mean, I think really I can't, it's not for me to justify it. It's up for those people in the room to sympathize with how one might end up there.
Did you actually show it to the client?
Probably yes. Probably. Clearly they didn't choose it.
Otherwise, I'd know what it was.
Yeah. But they're there. It's not about, I mean, it could have been for anything. They're there more as an example of having come a long way from Gill Sands.
Well,
And
we could
that's
end here, couldn't
that
we?
is for everybody here to decide to what extent they can identify with arriving there in typography. 10 years ago. It's 10 years ago.
So what have you been doing since then?
To pay the rent.
So this is what you call pay.
So there are now 2 or 3 examples coming of work. Proper work.
So you still do fashion?
Real work.
Who's this for? Apart from
Well, that's a very pertinent way of putting it, because actually it's for Raf Simons.
yeah.
So this marks a very distinct moment in my history. This is probably around about 2015 as well. Is it? You worked on it. Is it there?
I think so. Paul?
Sorry.
He's fully asleep. Yeah, let's say it's 2015, 16. Whenever Raf Simons started at 17. Thank you, Paul.
Well, you drew the fucking font. You should remember.
Yeah, you should.
No.
That's the you. Anyway,
I can't
so
remember.
we're all getting old, okay? It doesn't really matter, but it was a while ago. But most importantly, it's a kind of milestone moment. After about 25 lost years in my career, right? Definitely the 90s and the first 2000s. It was like kind of being a wandering individual with there being no really supportive reciprocation from the work that I'd done. Because after music, after record covers, because I did not choose a specific niche in which to work, and because, let's say, that the pentagram experience did not resolve into anything successful, I was not identified with any particular genre of what we might understand as profitable work in the discipline of graphic design. You know, I was not doing annual reports. I was not known for the corporate identity. I was not known for working in the airline industry. I chose not to fully immerse in fashion for various reasons. So I didn't specialize in anything. And you know, there was this sort of pop legend, but it was not connected to anything that anybody wanted to pay for. I mean, that was one of the problems of Pentagram. Nobody wanted to pay a partner's day rate for somebody who hadn't done the work before. Mm. And the fact that I did not epitomize any particular genre of work was also a handicap. And then, around about 2015, about 10 years ago, individuals who I had perhaps in one way or another been inspirational to, influential to, or just inspirational to, began to become the decision makers in their respective fields or organizations. And then it was them that called up. So this is perfect. Raf, you know, Raf had based a collection in 2004, a Raf Simons collection, on my archive that earned for me 1,000 euros. 1,000 euros. One Parker from that collection is now 25 to 30,000.
Wow.
Okay. I got a euro per garment in 2004.
But how many have you got in the archive?
2. And I think, if we haven't lost them. I didn't even go to the show in Paris because I couldn't afford to go. Someone said, why weren't you there? And I said, I couldn't fucking afford it. Oh, it's your only work. Yeah, I know it was my work. But in whenever it was, when Raf turns up at Calvin Klein and needs to do something about the Calvin Klein logo, he just said, I want Peter Saville to do it. Now, PVH, who are the group who own Calvin Klein, didn't know who I was from Adam. Paul, you're going to say something?
You're getting 70 different versions. They said they'd done before.
Oh, okay, okay, fine. So in-house, yeah, okay. The in-house, I guess, there was some in-house designers at Calvin Klein. They'd been trying to do it. Raf was not happy. And so he then said he wanted me to do it. And so the difference was that even though the board of the company had no idea who I was and were not interested in it, Raf had the final say. And this, I mention it because there's a repeat pattern through the next few bits of work. So Raf said, I want Peter to do it. And it was quite clear that the Calvin Klein font needed a looking at. But much more importantly, Raf Simons is not Calvin Klein. And the Calvin Klein, the historic Calvin Klein logo is upper and lowercase, in which case, and as such, it's very subjective. I mentioned this earlier about when you see your name in upper and lowercase. In upper and lowercase, it's the way you write your name. It's the way you write your name from childhood. So Calvin Klein wrote his name in a subjective manner. But Raf Simons is not Calvin Klein. Raf Simons inhabited the thing Calvin Klein, not the person Calvin Klein. So therefore, I felt that we had to shift it from the subjective to the objective and go from upper and lowercase to capital letters. And so that's what this capital letters proposal is about. And then we created a font called, what's it called? Klein.
Yeah, Klein.
Called Klein. Based on...
Avant-garde.
Based on, I mean, when we tried to find patient zero of the Calvin Klein identity, something showed up from the archive in New York, and I showed it to you, and you struggled to accurately identify it until you concluded that it was, in fact, Letraset. It was avant-garde Letraset.
Yeah.
Which I found I found that really charming, that in 1967 or whatever it was, when Calvin Klein founded his company, he'd made his own logo using Letraset.
Yeah.
And then Fabian Baron had
Futura.
Changed it to Futura. So Klein is a hybrid of the two. So that's that. So, and ditto. Riccardo Tisci turns up at Burberry and said, I would like Peter to do the logo. So this is what begins to happen the last 10 years is that I get invited to do things, not exclusively fashion. And better than that, paid for them without any argument by somebody in the company who says directly, we want Peter to do it. And because of this sort of like mythical, legendary status, no one questions my fee. I mean, it's not exactly as simple as that, but they expect it to be expensive. So I try to make it expensive. I'm still finding out where the limit is. We haven't found the limit yet. So Riccardo Tisci turned up, exactly as Calvin Klein, as Paul pointed out. Internally, they had been exploring a new Burberry logo for Riccardo. And they had very little time. He wanted to see it on his first collection. This is always the problem. Raf had been the same thing. They want their first collection to have this new logo. They don't realize the scale and gravitas of what they're taking on. Just, you know, a clothes designer thinks it's easy to have a new logo by the end of the month. So, you know, we literally had days to do this. the most insightful moment in doing it was I went in to see Ricardo. He was sitting in the boardroom of Burberry with the whole history of Burberry labels pinned up around the wall, and there were dozens of them. And he said to me, Peter, he said, finding a way to write Burberry in a trench coat is actually not that difficult. But he said, the same logo in a chiffon blouse, that's my problem. And I went, okay, fine. That was the brief. And in that summation, he focused entirely on the problem. You needed a Burberry that would work in a trench coat, but a Burberry that would work across the spectrum of the product that they were endeavoring to make. And, you know, we did a dozen directions for it, Paul and I. I tend to, you know, I think of things, Paul turns it into something. And Paul and I can be quite, because we've known each other a long time, we can be sometimes quite quick in spotting something. And one of my readings of Burberry is ladies in trench coats in fields.
Okay.
Now, in fetish culture, there is a tradition of ladies in trench coats in fields, and they're usually made out of rubber. And the great rubber couturier of Britain was a man called John Sutcliffe, and who worked in the 60s and 70s as a bespoke couturier of rubberware. He's not a household name for all of the obvious reasons. But, you know, he did work on Diana Rigg's costumes in leather for the Avengers, etc. So in certain circles, he was obviously well known.
He set up a magazine, didn't he?
He had a magazine. Now, how I knew about him was scouring the pornography dealers of Soho in the 80s. I would come across this weird magazine called Atom Age, which was ladies in trench coats in fields. And in one of my directions to Burberry was Atom Age. And I only had to say the word Atom Age to Paul, I hope not to embarrass you, and he knew exactly what I meant. So we were able to get so somewhere between Atom Age, sorry Paul, somewhere between Atom Age and a Range Rover, that was the version. Well, there were two that Ricardo liked. He kind of liked, there were 12 proposed very quickly. And one of them not dissimilar to where Daniel Lee has come back to. But there were 12 that we proposed, and Ricardo was like, I kind of like this, but I kind of like that. So from the two that he liked, we created this hybrid of, you know, kind of Range Rover. It's, all of that said, it's a really beautiful word to work with. The letter forms, all the letters are a similar size. And the kind of the repetition of the R and the B and things like that, it's a nice word to work with.
What do you think of the new Burberry logo?
Well, it's very elegant. And as I said, we put forward 12 possibilities. What one?
There was one like.
Yeah, there was one of the ones we put forward was not a million miles away from what Daniel Lee has chosen, and so it's really nice. It's very Burberry, and it would work in a trench coat and it would work in a chiffon blouse. My only questioning observation about it is the company had not even completed the rollout of this new identity across all of the stores, the packaging, etc., and already an incoming designer has wanted to impose his new reading on the company. And so it's premature. Shane Sproller, go on. Jonathan Aykroyd, who also came in as the new CEO, Jonathan should have said no. But obviously to appease Daniel Lee, Jonathan gave in. So you now have this in my opinion, confusing and bad for business scenario where you've got some old Burberry stuff knocking around in some parts of the world. You've got a lot of the Ricardo era Burberry, and you've got the Daniel Lee era. And in amongst all of the merch they do, there's a lot of this old stuff. And there's particularly the monogram, the TB monogram that we did, which turned out to be, that might have been, I mean, talk about turning base metal into gold. The TB monogram that we did that is coherent with this letter form was extraordinarily useful for Burberry. And it's not coherent with the new Burberry. So it's all over the place at Burberry. Okay, so same scenario.
Who's this for?
Johnny. So Jonathan Ive. Johnny chooses to part way with Apple, as is, I guess, reasonably well known to everybody. There's no secret about that. He and I did not actually know one another. Obviously, we knew of one another. And we did sit next to one another at a dinner probably about 20 years ago one night. And I knew who he was and he knew who I was, and that was about it. I never did anything for Apple. I think the influence of things that we had done at Peter Saville Associates was fairly evident in some aspects of the look of Apple. But, you know, as with much of, you know, I didn't actually, with much of my history, I didn't do it. And it used to irritate me a lot, actually, for all the obvious reasons. Until Johnny turned up in my studio one day and said, "Can I come and talk to you about something?" So, of course. And he explained that he left Apple or was in the process of leaving Apple, and he was going to set up a new studio of his own, and it would be called LoveFrom. And he asked me to do the logo, which was nice. So I did. Paul helped me. And I mean, it was a lengthy process. Johnny is extraordinary in his persistence and attention to detail. And no stone will be left unturned when doing something. And you can just, you know, you can, when you're doing something with him, you can sort of see how it must have been at Apple and how many iterations they had the time, the team, the money to make in order to arrive at the very refined places they ended up. I mean, it's not by chance. And when you do something with Johnny, it's a bit like the quantum universe. Anything that can happen will happen. You'd kind of, no stone is unturned. So our original solution for this was a sans serif font, because I was fairly certain he would want a sans serif font. The thing that Paul and I proposed was the comma. That's the bit. Without the comma, there's something a little bit too singular, abstract, and removed. It's possibly a greetings card brand.
Yeah.
The comma, which Paul and I stumbled over one evening whilst texting each other about the project, the comma introduces the notion of a dialogue. Because, you know, what Johnny was proposing is that, you know, these glasses from Love is love from Johnny Ive. It's love from me to you, the audience. So whatever they do, Johnny is doing it with love. So it's like, so that became meaningful when I put a comma there. So, I mean, I have to say in the end, it turned out to be a very expensive comma.
How much does the comma cost these days?
No idea, because the next stage of it was that Johnny thought that he wanted to move on from being with sans serif, and he was very excited about serifs, and he's particularly excited about the Section 25 Always Now. He said, you remember that Always Now cover you did, the Bembo one? He said, I really like that. So, you know, Paul and I then went down a serif typeface pathway, particularly in the direction of Baskerville, which was Paul's feeling for this. And we did a lot of work, and no stone was unturned, and a lot of exploration was done in new serif forms based on a Baskerville basic model. And then at the end of the day, Johnny said, I know, let's get Antonio to do it. So Antonio Cavadoni, who'd done the San Francisco form for Apple, and is, you know, unarguably very, you know, good at creating fonts. And also, there is this sort of extended family around Johnny. And so I think he thought it was only fair to engage Antonio in the LoveFrom group as he had engaged me and I'd engaged Paul. So Johnny then engaged Antonio, and Antonio created LoveFrom font, which is, you know, a huge type family now, and they use it a lot. So, moving swiftly on, very quickly. So,
Aston Martin.
Aston Martin. So, just as with Ricardo and Raf, Marek Reichman, who is, I think, he's the last remaining, you know, spirit of Aston Martin. Marek is the design director of Aston Martin. And even though he has a very exotic name, Marek Reichman, he's actually from Sheffield. And was born and raised in Sheffield, and is exactly in the demographic, and was a big, you know, Unknown Pleasures fan. So Unknown Pleasures made an impression upon Marek Reichman in his teens. And I think it contributed a little bit to some of his sense of aesthetics. And when the opportunity came with the acquisition, the controlling stake acquisition of Aston Martin by Lawrence Stroll, and some comments that I had made about the wing previously to Marek, about it looking a bit Battle of Britain, unexpectedly one afternoon, Marek sent me a text message saying, do you want to do the wing? So Lawrence had come in, was, you know, instigating a new contemporary awareness around Aston, understanding it as a, you know, not a car company, but a luxury company. And Marek got the green light to redo the logo, because the wing really needed redoing. It was, I'd seen it on the back of a Vantage one afternoon with him, and the Vantage is a particularly 21st century looking car. And the old wing looked like something that had fallen off a Spitfire. It was really incongruous. But of course, you had to do it without doing it. You know, you had to do it without change. I mean, nobody wants the Aston Martin wings to change, but they need to change, a bit like the Coca-Cola logo needs to change. So we took away a lot of things from inside that logo, and the lettering is now like 20% bigger, or 17% bigger, or something like that. So we just clarified the wing. And it was kind of interesting, because for the first few months, nobody in the company seemed to be the least bit interested in what we were doing. But then there was suddenly a point where Paul was sending in visuals when people in the engineering department got involved. And then they went mad. Then Paul, can you remember his name, Paul? What's his name? You can't remember his name? He's Marek's deputy designer. Miles.
No, he can't hear.
Okay, so there were individuals who suddenly got wildly excited about the exact radiusing of a curve, and made it quite arduous for Paul to finally arrive. No, sorry, they helped. They helped. All right, they helped, because they had to engineer it anyway. So it wasn't too bad. They obviously helped, but they got interested. The key thing is they did, at the 11th hour, get very interested. And I mean, it's a very beautiful badge. But each one handmade.
But the lettering, you have a story about the lettering.
Okay, the lettering. Lettering was a killer, really, because first instinct was just to take it into sans. I mean, they had a version of Optima that they'd had for 10 or 15 years, and the first instinct was just, let's go to sans. And the funny thing is that when you see Aston Martin in sans, it looks like a backstreet workshop in Birmingham run by somebody called Martin. It just lost everything. Suddenly it's, oh, it's Aston Martin. It's suddenly a bloke called Martin who's got a workshop in Aston. It was uncanny. The Optima, and so the title of this talk was Semiotics. The Optima spoke of engraved names in Portland stone. The Optima spoke of the discreet nameplate outside the Berkeley Hotel. The Optima spoke of English stately homes. The Optima spoke of the establishment connotations that an Aston Martin has. And I realized that stepping away from it suddenly took away all of those class codes that are synonymous with an Aston Martin. So we had to create a new font that retained some of those Optima characteristics. And Paul worked with Dalton Marg and created a serif font, which I think is called Aston Martin Flair, and a sans serif, which was the important one for the HMI, the electrical interface in the dashboard, all of the information technology that needs to look contemporary. We needed a sans serif for that, and so there's Aston Martin sans, and the Aston Martin Flair to be kept as like a headline font to just not lose this sense of birthright of Aston Martin. Max Davis, Ferragamo, Marco Gabbetti, the man who had been the CEO at Burberry when we did the Burberry for Riccardo, Marco then went to Ferragamo. He took an interesting young man from Manchester called Max Davis to do the collection, and both Marco and Max decided they wanted Peter to do the logo. So, so Paul and I did the logo.
So it's
why I made the point about the Burberry being really nice to work with. Ferragamo wasn't. There's a set of letter combinations in there that were very difficult, and they're still difficult, and Paul probably still doesn't like looking at them. But they were really difficult. But with regard to the font itself, I mean, when you're asked to do these things, I mean, I put myself into the scenario and say, what would I want? And because there's not a brief, I mean, there was no brief. I mean, Riccardo's comment about the chiffon brows was insightful, but it's not specifically a brief. It's incumbent upon me to say or show how I would do this if it was me. And to a great extent, when these individuals come to me because they're like fans, because I was part of their worldview, that's kind of what they want. You know, Marek wanted to know, what would I do with Aston Martin? And so there were 20 different ways of thinking about Ferragamo. The Salvatore got to go, it had to become Ferragamo the thing. So, you know, and I mean, it's so exotic, the word Ferragamo. We had 20, 30 exotic ways of understanding Ferragamo. And like, then you have to see if any of those forms connect with the person who's going to be the decision maker. And it was very interesting. This is based on a bit of British inscriptional lettering called Petit Serif, I think, that Paul found in Percy Smith. Yep, called. I mean, I don't have any of this stuff anymore. Fortunately, there are people I've worked with, particularly Paul, and as Brett had been, as you are, who may have maintained an interest in typographic culture. So this was one of the letter forms that we felt was a way to understand Ferragamo. Interestingly, when we went through them with Max, just as with Kate Moss, he stopped at this immediately and said, that's the one I want. He said, that's it. And we said, well, there's another 20 pages. Yeah, okay, fine, but that's the one I want. And we got to the end of it and he went straight back to it and said, that's it. And I have to say that Max was right. It's actually really, really good for Ferragamo. It makes Ferragamo look as if they'd always been there. You could almost imagine that that was the original Ferragamo logo. Okay.
So we're coming towards the end.
Good. Let's get towards the end. So some people in the audience may know about this, others won't. The ridiculous decision last year that Chanel would host their Art de Métier collection, which is their most important collection of the year, which is a one-off collection once a year. They would host the show, or they would have the show for Art de Métier in Manchester. This was a peculiar decision to make, but Virginie Viardi and her pal Sofia Coppola decided that it would be really exciting to have the show in Manchester in December, outside.
Have they been to Manchester before?
That was my first question. Has anybody been, if any of the people thinking this is a good idea been to Manchester?
At that time?
The answer was no, but we're all very excited. So once this connection, well, once they settled on Manchester, then certain people said, then you have to speak to Peter. So from like July last year, I got engaged with this problem of Chanel going to Manchester. And they wanted a signifier for it. Just go back to the first thing, Paul. Good, can you go back? Okay, so they want the signifier. And this is what arose. Basically, MCR is the recognized abbreviation for the city of Manchester, and Chanel would be in Manchester. So we took the C from the Chanel logo type, and Paul created an M and an R to complement it, and we showed it to them. And they were utterly underwhelmed. It was, not exactly what we wanted.
What did they want?
They didn't really know what they wanted, but they didn't want that. It was a bit too harsh. It was simple. They didn't really get it. They didn't see, or they were not able to see at the time, how much it would endear them to Manchester itself by becoming, in a way, part of Manchester.
They hadn't been.
No, and anyway, but it survived, and it did become very center stage at the end. So at the end, it was wonderfully effective the way that it was introduced in the end. But they sort of wanted something to give to people from Peter Saville, and it ended up being a record. I mean, we thought it was going to be a garment or a sweater or a t-shirt, and the Art de Métier is all of the workshops that supply the craftsmanship for the couture collection. So it's actually a really important show. And so we thought it would be something made by the artisans. And I was looking for something to connect Chanel history in Manchester. And we ended up looking at the jacquard loom cards, which were effectively binary, late 18th century binary code, or early 19th century binary code. The cards that went into the early looms to create the patterns being woven. And I saw a sort of synergy between the binary code on the jacquard loom cards and binary code as Alan Turing had utilized in creating the computers in Manchester, which then the musicians and bands that I then worked with in the 1890s used for their equipment. And so in this coding, we saw a connection between the textile industry of Manchester, which was one of the fundamental reasons for Chanel to be there, and Gabrielle Chanel herself had ordered a lot of fabrics, had come from Manchester in the 1920s and 30s. So there was actually a genuine connection between Chanel and Manchester, and that connection was based in fabrics. So I wanted to try and create like an arc connecting Manchester's textile industry with the evolution of the city, and then the music culture, which is why Virginie wanted to go there. So this pattern was like a metaphor for all of that. And we created it just as a pattern. We put Chanel and MCR together with a degree of serendipitous accident, which always happens when you're working on screen. Something fabulous happened that we didn't really mean to do, but you know, we saw it once it appeared, where the pattern obliterated the letters. And we sent it to Chanel. And they loved it, but they didn't know what to do with it. And then, unbelievably, I guess Virginie, who was the decision maker, Virginie probably said, well, it looks like a record sleeve.
And it became one.
So they said, let's do a record. So unbelievably, in the course of about 1 month, Chanel made a record of famous Manchester dance tracks. They're a quite impressive company to make things happen when they decide to, as they did with the show. I mean, they built an entire steel atrium the length of a street for that show. And they turned around a record, all of the tracks, and the record sleeve. And one of the most charming moments in the production of that sleeve was, I kind of thought, well, but you don't know anything about printing record sleeves. Like, you don't know how difficult it is to get sleeves. It's very difficult to get records pressed these days.
Yeah.
And as for sleeves, they're really difficult. You can't just go to your printer. So I said, who's going to print it? And they said, oh, well, you know, our printer will do it. And I went, no, you don't know. And you don't know what you don't know. You've got 3 weeks, and you know this is not going to work. And I said, who is that? And they said, Steidl. They went, oh, really? And I said, can they do it? Yeah, they can do it. They can do anything. And it led to me having a conversation with Gerhard Steidl. Well, don't ask him if he can do something. Yeah, he can do something. And he did all of it. He pressed the record. Or his friend in the next village pressed the record because he has a pressing plant. And Gerhard Steidl produced his sleeve. And it is immaculate. And when we sent the visual of the artwork, he said, there's a lot of colors here, Peter. And Paul and I had chosen colors based on like an industrial palette of Manchester, street furniture and other such things inspired the colors. And we were expecting the printer to say, okay, what do you want to lose? Or I'm going to do this in 4-color process. And Gerhard just said, there's a lot of colors. I said, yeah, I know. And he said, there's 11. And I said, and he said, how do you see this? And I said, well, I had thought they might be foil. And he laughed. And he said, yeah. He said, but you never match the color. He said, we have to print these colors. And I said, but it's 11. He said, yeah, fine. It's just 3 passes. He said, it's just 3 passes.
Yeah.
And I said, will you do that? And he said, yeah. And I said, you've got 10 days. He said, don't tell me. I know what I'm doing. He's very German. And then he said, there's a couple of black things on the side. He said, I expect they're holes. And I said, well, we thought they could be. He said, so you want to die cut those? Yeah. And he said, I suppose you want the colors embossed as well. And I said, well, he said, yeah, we do it. And he did the entire thing. And when I saw those sleeves delivered, they look as if they're double here. I mean, they are immaculately printed. Every single one of those dots is radiused embossed. The 2 black things, which actually would hold the jacquard loom, they are holes.
So,
last thing. Okay, so as an entirely sentimental bit of semiotics, it struck me that my parents, they're not signatures, my parents signing off to me, my mother's, which was always quite sweet, and my dad's, which was usually in a bad mood, has represented to me of them as individuals as a photo. And in a way, because photographs, you know, are different across someone's lifetime, I realized that my mother's way of writing mum and my father's way of writing dad were as familiar to me as being with them, as speaking to them. And I got, you know, my mother died about 11 or 12 years ago, and Dad had died 20 years ago. And I got made in neon. So they're at home with me. And I quite like it. And I proposed it to Paul, said Paul Stolper. We offered it as an addition, but not to be my mum and dad. The concept being that somebody could have, you know, would use their own parents'
mum and dad
writing. But apart from Paul himself, no one's ordered one yet. Anyway, I'm very happy to have them myself, and they do. I mean, I'm sure everyone in the room understands that letter forms are extraordinarily personal and have a personality. And in this particular instance, it's the personality of my parents.
So I think that's the end.
That's it.